So we'll talk about growing great tomatoes this morning. There are a lot of ways to grow tomatoes, a lot of details to it, and there's not just one way. There's a lot of practices, but there are some basic good practices that everybody can follow to have a good tomato crop. So you can say it tomato or tomato. The main thing, it is a fruit that we use as a vegetable. It's actually a berry. And we already did the poll. So it did originate, they think they've traced it back to Ecuador. There are weeds there that are cherry type. It did work its way around South America and up into Mexico. When the Americas were colonized by Europeans, they took the tomatoes home, and they were adopted in Europe and Asia in the 16th and 17th century, and it was thought that they were yellow. So they took a hold of it in Italy, obviously, with pizza and spaghetti and lasagna, but I'm thinking maybe salsa came before pizza. Who knows? It didn't take off in the United States until the 1780s. There's recipes from New Orleans in 1812. So part of the problem in the United States is that people thought it was poisonous. There was a guy in New Jersey that he told everybody he was going to eat a basket of tomatoes that they all thought was poisonous, and he ate this basket of tomatoes and he lived. So that was a big event back then. But Thomas Jefferson and some Italian immigrants and others were eating tomatoes. The general population thought they were poisonous, and they even thought they were repulsive and tasted awful. But by the 1800s, tomato seeds were available, and by 1863 there was 24 varieties, and they had names like Wolf Peach, Love Apple, and Jerusalem Apple. It is true that the leaves and stems are toxic, and I have found when the hornworms, tomato or tobacco hornworms, are eating my plants, and I try and feed those to my chickens, they'll taste one or two, and then after that, if I throw them to them, they look away, and I think it's because of all the toxins they pick up from the tomato plant. My chickens don't like to eat them. So they are from the Solanum family, the nightshades, Solanacea. And many of this family are toxic, but we have gone from thinking that they're totally poisonous and you shouldn't eat them and they're terrible to being the most important horticulture crop globally. So that family also includes peppers, potatoes, tomatillos, eggplant, petunia, and tobacco. And there are also some weeds that are in the Solanaceous family. So when you're rotating, those plants are in the same family, and you have to rotate outside of that family in the garden. You can graft a tomato and a tobacco plant, and then the tomato will have some nicotine in it, but it's still edible. And you can do a tomato and a potato plant and call it a pomato. So I think that would be very fun to do in a class sometime. I'm going to give it a try one day. They're very good for you. They're rich in vitamins A and C, a good source of potassium, low in calories, and they have lycopene, which is an antioxidant that protects cells from oxygen damage. So what is the perfect tomato? Well, that can depend on a lot of things, individual choice. So there's different types of tomatoes with determinate or indeterminate growth. There's all sizes. There's dwarf and patio. There's even some very tiny ones that you can put in hanging baskets. Some people look at days to harvest. Early Girl is a really good early harvest tomato that ripens in 58 days after planting. There is fruit sizes vary. There's big slicers that are good for hamburgers, and then the little cherry and grape tomatoes are great for snacking. So the usage will vary. You know, what tomato you want will vary depending on how you plan to use it. There's all different colors, which is neat. There's red, pink, yellow, purple, green. Some are almost kind of white. And then there's different flavor complexities. There's sweetness and acidity. And then there's another thing we'll talk about in a little bit here. You can plant hybrids or you can plant heirlooms. And the tomato for sauce, or some people even like it for eating, they want a small seed cavity with not many seeds in it and a lower moisture content. So sometimes you're selecting for a small seed cavity, not too many seeds, and low moisture content. You also can select for disease and nematode and heat resistance, which can really help if you're organic. It can help if you're not organic too. It helps keep your plants alive and reduce the sprays that you need. Some people are choosing, especially commercial people, for shipping qualities, tomatoes that hold up well when they're shipped and held in storage for a while. And then you can also select tomatoes that don't crack open, ones that don't develop green shoulder, and ones that have blossom end rot resistance. So there's a lot of things that you can look at for your perfect tomato. This is the other factor that is attributed to tomatoes and also other foods. It's called umami. It's a Japanese word for savory, and they have determined that there are actual taste buds on your tongue that taste this. Besides sugar and salt, you can taste umami. It's kind of a savory flavor, and that's glutamates have that flavor, and that's why we add them to food. So there's quite a few foods that have this: green tea, celery, spinach, fish, meats. And tomatoes have a complex flavor. There's 25 different volatile chemicals that contribute to their flavor. It is said they're somewhat reduced in modern varieties, with just 13 of these being predominant. Larger tomatoes tend to have less flavor and less sugar than a smaller tomato. I've always said the cherry tomatoes, to me, have the best flavor of all the tomatoes. So there's, depending on who you see, 6,500, 10,000 varieties. There's a lot of varieties out there. San Marzano is a really popular sauce tomato. These are all ones that different people have told me is their favorite. I grew outhouse cherries for a while. It was a tiny little cherry, and it had really good flavor too. So you might want to type in the chat what your flavor is, just for the heck of it. Tell us what you like. You can refer to, for varieties, there's many places you can find recommended varieties. UK has ID 133 that has vegetable cultivars for Kentucky gardens and lists some tomatoes. You can check the All-American selections. Big Beef is a really popular one. It's an All-American selection, has a great disease package. It's a good slicer tomato. So one thing that a lot of people do locally, and I'm sure around the world, is buy a cheater tomato. And this gets you tomatoes earlier in the year. They go out to the local nursery and they buy these tomatoes that are all already flowering, maybe even have fruit on them. People like to have bragging rights for the first tomato. So you can start them early indoors yourself. If they're planted early, outside, you would need to use water rings around them or some type of protection against cold, because at least in Kentucky, we have a lot of fluctuation. We'll get up in the 80s and then back down and have a frost. The best nighttime temperature for tomatoes is between 59 and 68 degrees, and we'll talk about that more later too. The largest tomato that's been harvested is 7 pounds, 12 ounces, and there was a giant tomato tree in Disney World that lived 13 months, and it was from China, and they collected 32,000 cherry tomatoes, golf ball size, off of that tree before it died. It got diseased and died. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about if you wanted to start your own seeds. And this is something my master gardeners have said, you need to talk about that, because they think I have pretty good luck with them. For tomatoes, you want to use a larger cell tray most of the time, one that has 72 cells in the tray. Ideally, they'd be 2 inches deep and wide. You can raise tomatoes in smaller cells, and they will catch up. You can start seeds 5 to 8 weeks before the transplant date, and use sterile potting or seed starting mix. It helps if you pre-moisten that soil before you put it in the tray, but I don't always. You can also mist it once it's in. And you plant them 1/4 inch deep, and then you cover them with a dome lid. And this is something that I make myself do, is go ahead and label the varieties. Sometimes I cut plant tags in half and stick them in there. And I do every single cell, because I usually plant a variety and it is very easy to forget and mix up your plants. So I stick a tag in every single cell. But if you did the whole tray the same, you could just label the tray. Write down somewhere what your planting date is and keep your varieties noted in a journal. It's good practice. It helps you when you want to go back, and if there's some unusual variety you tried and you can't remember the name, you can go back and look. Seeds will germinate best from 75 to 85 degrees. They like to be germinated in the dark. I don't think you absolutely have to, but they do germinate well in the dark. You can mist them while you're waiting for them to germinate as needed, or you can bottom water. I've always favored misting. I feel like I control the moisture a little bit better. Um, you watch them closely and move them to light when they start to germinate. You've got to get, if you've got them in the dark, you need to get them uncovered and get them in light, or they can stretch really fast. And then it says 1 to 2 weeks to germinate, but I believe I get them up in 3 or 4 days. When I use a heat mat underneath them, they can pop out of there pretty quick. So generally I will use a heat mat. I have high germination rates with my plants, and so a lot of things will say to put 2 or 3 seeds in a cell, but seeds can be kind of expensive and I don't really enjoy cutting them off. So I usually just do 2 or 3 cells with 2 seeds. And then if I need an extra plant, I have one, but I don't have to pull up 72 plants or cut them off. If you do want to do 2 seeds per cell, then you need to go through and cut one of them off or pull it up. So you just have 1 plant per cell. As you're growing them, you want the lighting 4 inches above the plants if it's fluorescent or LED. If you have hot light bulbs like metal halide, then you need to have it up higher, 10 or 12 inches above the plants. I keep my lights on 14 to 16 hours. I'm lazy, so I put mine on a timer where I've had lights going in our garage here at work for about 3 or 4 months, and it comes on at 6 in the morning and goes off at 10, and I never touch it. It does help to grow tomatoes at a little cooler temperature, and also I lower it to 65. I like to have lower temperature at night and a warmer temperature in the daytime. If you grow them at a hot temperature, they will grow faster, but maybe not as compact a plant. And then once you get your first true leaf, then you can start using half-strength liquid fertilizer and use that every 2 weeks. One of the worst things and most common problems for new people raising plants is to overwater, and they kill off their seedlings. There's several disease organisms that will grow in the soil and kill seedlings. So do not overwater. You know, I check mine every day, sometimes twice a day. And the ones that are drying out, I give water. I have to say, we've done many classes and programs this year, so I have been checking the water on those plants every day for about 3 months. But it's just kind of the one day I didn't, I had a plant almost wilt and die. So you have to be a little bit neurotic with seedlings and really keep an eye on them. It can help to have some movement on the plants. It makes the stem stronger if you can brush them or have a light breeze or something like that to make them strengthen their stems. It's like a tree that you grow. If you stake it too tight, the trunk isn't strong. They've got to have some movement. And then before you plant them, you're going to harden them off, put them in the shade for a couple of hours, and then gradually increase their exposure to sunlight and toughen them up a little bit. Okay, so your light spectrum, I just got into this a little bit for this class. I was looking at it and reading the research. And I have, generally they say use a mix of warm and cool light bulbs for an improved spectrum. And the NASA research does show that plants use mostly red and blue wavelengths. And it's about I think a 7-to-1 ratio of red to blue. The red is used for stem and leaf growth and regulate flowering, dormancy, and seed germination. And then the blue is used for chlorophyll content, leaf thickness, but too much blue and you can stun a plant. They will also change these ratios depending on what plant they're growing and what stage of growth it's in. And then they do also use green and far red light and some yellow, and the green and far red will penetrate to lower leaves. That's one of the issues with growing plants indoors. As they get big, it gets hard to get light to that lower canopy, and I think that's one of the reasons they tend to get scraggly. So that you can use different mixes of light if you're professional growing plants. And then they also sell the white LED bulbs that they sometimes claim are best for growing plants, but they don't necessarily put out the light that plants need. So I think right now I'm still a proponent of using a mix of warm and cool light bulbs, whether you use LED or fluorescent or another type of light if you can. because they need a lot of red and blue, small amounts of green and yellow, and a little bit of infrared and near infrared and near UV. With plants, the intensity of light is important if you can get it. Lumen is what our eyes see, but plants don't really, lumen doesn't really apply to plants. So they've come up with these other terms, PAR and PPFD, that you may see down the road of, applied to grow lights, which would be a better measurement of what a plant needs. And you can just give up on trying to make your light bulbs like sunlight. It's not going to happen. Sunlight is 98,000 lumens per square meter, and a 100-watt light bulb is more like 1,600 lumens. So we're never going to approach sunlight, but we can try and get the spectrum that the plants need. Okay, tomatoes are a tropical plant, so they like it hot. They like it 65 to 85 degrees. When you get down 55 degrees lower, you start to see poor pollination, poor fruit set, flowers drop. You can have fruit that's got a bad shape, cat facing, and all those kinds of things. And then when you get above 95 degrees, and I have a lot of trouble with this in my high tunnel, you can have a reduced fruit set, and you get fruit that just doesn't turn red. It's got an orange color. So if you get temperatures even below 60 degrees for extended time, sometimes you get a lot of flowering, but those flowers remain open and they never form fruits. So heirloom versus hybrid. Heirlooms are tomatoes that are open pollinated, and a general description of what's an heirloom is that it's 50 years old. It's been around a long time. The seeds will be true to the variety if they're isolated where there can't be cross pollinations. You can save seeds from these plants. Mostly they are self or insect pollinated. So a distance of 5 to 15 feet, you probably want to go at least 15 from other tomato plants to prevent cross pollination will help you if you're trying to save seeds from an heirloom plant. Most of these have great flavor, but they've got about 0 disease resistance. So if you're looking for disease resistance, the heirloom tomatoes are a problem. Hybrid tomatoes are cross-pollinated between 2 pure parent lines. So they are getting characteristics from both parents. And so the plant will have these great characteristics from the 2 pure parent lines. But if you save the seeds from those, you can get anything. So that's why hybrids we don't save seeds from unless you don't care what the offspring look like. They do have some hybrid vigor, makes them a little more, when you cross the 2 outliers, you get some hybrid vigor that makes them grow better, fruit better, have a higher yield. Okay, and these are generally self-pollinated. If you like the heirlooms, there is a Seed Savers online that you can go to and get information from. This is a good picture of, it's a little fuzzy, but it's a good picture to show determinate versus indeterminate. So the determinate is on the left, and these are going to flower, and they're self-topping. They'll get to a certain height, say 3 feet or 4 feet, and they'll bloom up and down their length. And then within 4 to 6 weeks, they'll set all that fruit, and they're done. And so there's no more flowers on this plant. It's just setting fruit. And then the indeterminate bloom up, it's really a vine, and it blooms up the vine. And so you've got your ripe fruit here, your fruit forming here, and blooms on up. And it will keep growing and growing. And if it never freezes or gets diseased, it's a perennial, a tender perennial. It can just grow forever. So they're a weak vine, tender perennials, and they need support. You can let them grow on the ground, but you're going to increase the indeterminate ones. You're going to increase your disease and fruit rot. The vines will produce until they're killed by cold. I think I pulled mine out of my high tunnel last year sometime in November. I was tired of them, and I don't heat in the winter. You can you prune the suckers to keep them manageable. They can send out a lot of suckers. If you are training them to a trellis or a stake, if you don't prune those suckers, it can get pretty wild. So doing that helps improve the air circulation and the spray coverage. They will continue to flower up the vine. People remove the spent leaves at the bottom to control disease and to improve airflow. So you're getting airflow here under these vines, and you're just taking those leaves off. So they usually get diseased and start to look bad, and just clean those up and get them out of there. Vines can grow 30 to 40 feet long in 10 months in a greenhouse. For indeterminate tomatoes, you space them 3 to 4 feet apart in the garden. In my greenhouse, I space them about 2 feet apart. You're going to stake, if you're going to stake them, the stake should be 4 inches from the plant, and use a big stake because they're a big plant. So like an 8-foot stake that you drive at least a foot in the ground. And then you can tie the plant to it with soft cloth. And generally with the stake, they recommend that you prune it to 2 vines. With pruning, the one thing with pruning is you can't increase sunburn on the tomatoes. The tomatoes need some leaf cover to prevent them from getting sunburn. You can also use large cages that are at least 18 inches in diameter, and they need to have 6-inch holes so you can reach your hand through and get the tomatoes. And generally, they don't prune as much in a large cage, so you're going to have less sunburn with them. You can trellis them with 3 to 6-inch posts or metal T-posts at the ends of a row. And then you put 3 to 4-inch posts every 12 to 20 feet. And then you stretch a wire over the top of that. And probably it's a good idea to have a tensioner on the wire to tighten it up. It just kind of, you turn it and it you can wrap the wire around it if it starts to stretch and get loose. And then if you do that, you need to prune to 1 to 2 vines. And keep in mind on a trellis, it does need to be heavy duty because plants are heavy when they get loaded with tomatoes. I've had a trellis with about 25 plants and just 4x4 posts on the ends. And then I just put some posts under the wire for support, and I cracked a 4x4 post. So the weight of the tomatoes is greater than you think, and it takes a pretty heavy duty support to hold them up. You can use twine to attach the tomatoes. See how they're actually on a twine, and these are tomato clips. And wind the, can you all see my marker? My pointer when I move it? Might need to get the pointer up here. Okay. So these are clear or white plastic tomato clips with the twine running up. And you could do this. I haven't tried this outside. I think people do trellis them outside. I kind of worry about the wind. If you get a really big storm, how that would affect a plant that's trellised if you do this method. And I use baler twine. I bought some tomato twine once, and it wasn't nearly as strong as baler twine, so I use baler twine for mine. You can also just wind the twine around the stem and not deal with the tomato clips, because the tomato clips are a pain to take off. If you have very many tomato plants, when you're done, taking all those little tomato clips off is one of my least favorite jobs. I will say, if you did this at the bottom, as the vines get long, take the bottom tomato clips off, because sometimes that bottom vine gets so wide and fat you can't get the clip off. So as you're removing tomatoes and they're going up the vine, it wouldn't hurt to take those bottom tomato clips off. And in this, if you're trellising, you're going to there's black tomato clips. And one thing a tomato clip has, see that little notch in the back? That's where the string goes and holds it. And I found that out the hard way. Nobody told me. It took me a while to figure it out. But anyway, that the string goes in that notch, and that's what holds it. And you don't have to tie it at all. The clip, this is just a loose piece of string, and the clip is around the base of the stem. And then every 12 inches or so, you put another clip and support the plant going up the string. The string is tied to the wire at the top, and you're just letting that vine grow up the string. You do have to remove the sucker. So here's a sucker that comes out of the leaf axle, and you pinch that off. Here's another one, pinch it off. And that one's a little big. You like to get them when they're small. You train that up. So this is a commercial picture, but it shows you, it's a good picture of tomatoes that are staked. And I'm pretty sure these are Determinate tomatoes. This was actually a Mennonite farm in Christian County that I went to. Those tomato plants maybe are a little bit close. They look beautiful, but they could have used a little more airflow. Not in this greenhouse, but in another one, they were having problems with disease. And I think it was gray leaf mold. And some of it was just lack of air movement. So you do have to watch your spacing a little bit to have some airflow. But anyway, in a determinate tomato, they will set all the fruit in 4 to 6 weeks. The bushes grow 3 to 4 feet tall, and they space them 18 inches to 2 feet apart. There are fewer cultivars than with indeterminate, so there's not as many choices. They are better for containers than an indeterminate, and generally they say to pinch up the suckers to the first set of blooms. There are some recommendations out there to leave 1 or 2 suckers below the bloom, and that this will reduce leaf curl and they'll ripen earlier. I haven't tried that. Might try it on one and see if that's true. But removing those bottom suckers helps improve airflow, and it helps to prevent having tomatoes on the ground, which get diseased, and it's just not as sanitary. You can use pots, containers, stake. You can use the Florida weave method for holding them up, and you can use cages or tomato ladders. And I don't have a good picture of a tomato ladder, and I've never used one, but it seems to be gaining in popularity, where it really does look like a ladder with just 3 slats on each side. And then you could fold those up and put them away. They would store pretty well instead of using a cage. But with the Florida weave method, you can see this twine running a little bit right here, and they'll just have 2 plants between the stakes and run that twine down and twist it around each post, and they'll do that as they grow to hold them up. It's if you're growing a lot of tomatoes, it helps to have have a way to grow them that is where it's easy to store. It's easy to store the stakes. It's easy to store cages that will stack, cages that are made out of just fence that's wrapped in a circle. I've seen people have great big piles of them out in their garden. They didn't have a place to store them. They take a lot of space up. Then there's something in between. It's like Goldilocks. There's the in between, and so there's semi-determinate. You don't see them mentioned as often, and sometimes some of these semi-determinates get labeled as determinates. Some can be used in containers. They don't get too big. Many are beefsteak cultivars, and they'll grow 3 to 8 feet tall. The spacing on them, you could do 18 inches to 3 feet apart, depending on how big a plant it is and how you garden, and all the same methods of holding the plants up. If you prune them some, you'll get larger fruit and earlier ripening. You'll probably have some fewer fruit, but you do get larger fruit. A couple classic semi-determinate tomato plants are Carolina Gold and Celebrity, and this other one, BHN 589, I've grown quite a bit. And I will say they were listed as determinate, and I didn't know this back then, but they kept burying and burying in my high tunnel. And actually, the Carolina Gold would play out, but the BHN 589 produced a long time. So they really are semi-determinate, and some of them play out earlier than others. Some of them are more determinate than others, and some of them keep on producing longer. So there's kind of a range in the semi-determinate tomatoes. They don't produce just in 4 to 6 weeks. They produce over a longer period of time. I think the Carolina Gold plays out fairly early. So here's some pictures of some tomato cages. What I'm talking about, these will stack, but a lot of these are really not big enough except for maybe a determinate tomato. Those are pretty small. These are bigger. And then I love this wire cage. We used it for the first time last year, and it folds up so it will store really well. It just folds up. It was fairly pricey to buy, but it is something you could make yourself out of cattle panels. It does have these big openings where you can reach your hand through and work with the tomatoes. I did drive a stake. When we used them in the garden, I put a stake next to it and tied the stake to it just so if there was a big wind, it wouldn't blow over. But that's a pretty nice cage. Probably could make your own fairly easily. There are also paste tomatoes, and these are meaty tomatoes with few seeds. They have high soluble solids and viscosity and less juice, so it doesn't take as long to cook them down. They have an intense flavor when they're cooked down, and so these are great sauce tomatoes. The San Marzano is a heirloom, and it's indeterminate. It'll keep on producing. And the Amish paste is an heirloom. Romas are a more compact paste tomato that are determinate. There's Margarita, Super Sauce, Miroma, and there's one with a tiny plant that only gets 10 to 24 inches tall called Yaqui. So there is a specific type of tomato that's good for making sauce, and you won't have to spend near as much time cooking it down. There are dwarf tomatoes, which save space, and they can have great taste. There's more varieties being developed. They have less leaf area, so this is something that kind of surprised some of our people last year, I think, is that they're going to have fewer fruit, or maybe we're disappointed that we didn't have as much fruit as we normally do because we planted some dwarf tomatoes. They'll get 2 to 4.5 feet tall, and they have all sizes, shapes, and colors of fruit and flavors. You have minimal pruning on these. You don't prune them near as much. You can grow them in a 5-gallon bucket since they're small. And most of these are actually indeterminate. They'll keep on growing. So they may still need some staking or caging. So there was a dwarf tomato project that really contributed to the number of cultivars of dwarf tomatoes that are available. And it began in 2005, 2006. I think from what I've read online, it's kind of dwindled and they're sort of wrapping it up. It's still online, but maybe not as active as they were. But it was 2 people that were talking on a tomato chat from the United States and Australia. And it became a multiple continent project. It's all volunteers. There were 100 volunteers, and they were talking on the Tomatoville chat online. And they just developed their own dwarf tomato plants voluntarily, and then they just gave them away to seed companies to propagate. So they've had 125 releases, and all of those releases can be found at the Victory Seed Company website. They did release them to other companies as well. So if you went to the Dwarf Tomato Project, you could find the other companies that are also selling some of the seeds. But these plants, these dwarf plants, tend to be very stout, and their foliage tends to have a bluish green color, and kind of the leaves are kind of puckered and wrinkled. That's called rugose. The yield's going to be less because they're a smaller plant. So there was all these dwarf tomatoes were just developed by gardeners that decided they were going to do it, and they're out there on the market. There are also the cherry and grape tomatoes. And the difference between the cherry and the grape, besides shape, is the cherry tomatoes have more juice, and they're a round shape, and they're sweeter, and they have a little more flavor complexity. So they're considered the best ones for stuffing or hors d'oeuvres. And I think they're pretty prolific producers. And I think they're great. Well, both of these are great for just snacking when you're out in the garden if you're hungry. The grape tomatoes are meatier and have a thicker skin, and they're the oblong shape. So they're pretty interchangeable between the two if you want to use them for grilling and kebabs and snacking and that kind of thing. When you purchase your tomatoes, you want to get stocky, dark green plants. And these are actually not as stocky. This was a picture from online. I could show you better tomato plants. I need to go get a better picture. Those are decent, but you can get them stockier. You want to make sure when you buy plants that they are disease-free, that they're really clean, there's no spots on them, no disease, because you can bring home late blight or bacterial spot to your garden. Those are diseases that bacterial spot can be in seeds and can be propagated. So make sure you don't bring something home. I think the year we got late blight, it came from Florida or the South where they were propagating tomatoes and that had late blight on them, and we brought it into Kentucky. Okay, there's grafted tomatoes that you can buy. These are typically larger fruit and yields on these grafted tomatoes. One of the big reasons people use grafted tomatoes is resistance to soil-borne diseases and root nematodes. Root nematodes, both of those things, soil-borne diseases and root nematodes, can be difficult to deal with. You can rotate, but they can persist for many years. So if space is a problem and you've got these issues, using a grafted tomato can help you raise tomatoes. So they can yield as much as 3 times more than an ungrafted one of the same cultivar. The other thing is if you want to raise heirlooms, and heirlooms have a poor disease package, then you can graft to this root stock, and that will help you with the heirloom varieties. You cannot plant a graft below the ground, or the scion, the top part, could root, and then you lose your disease resistance. So that is a tomato you can't plant deep. And then you don't want to let suckers from the graft take root. You want to pull them off. So no suckers off the root part, and don't plant the top part in the ground. You don't want it to grow roots. Tomato fertilization, as always, we say soil test. Amend the garden before you plant it with adequate calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and you want some nitrogen. And you're going to till in your amendments 6 to 8 inches deep. If you don't have a soil test, you can use a complete fertilizer like 6-24-24 and use 2 to 3 pounds per 100 square feet. And you can see the 6 is, the first number is the nitrogen and it's low. The next one's phosphorus and the third one's potassium. So 6 of nitrogen, 24 of phosphorus, and 24 of potassium in 100 pounds. Additional fertilizer you can do as they're growing. Once they start to set fruit, you can put a tablespoon of ammonium nitrate in a 6 to 10 inch circle around the base of each plant every other week and give it some extra nitrogen fertilizer. You don't want to go crazy with the nitrogen because you get what's called bullish growth. And I've done this before, and you get leaves coming out of leaves and leaves coming out of the flower cluster, and they can just kind of go crazy. So too much nitrogen is a bad thing. You want it just right. For organic, you can use compost, blood meal, seaweed, and fish emulsion as your fertilizer. If you put on manure, you need to wait 120 days before you plant in it. I think it's less if you're, well, that's if you're doing leafy things. Less if you're planting tomatoes, but I usually try not to put manure on. I try and use compost because it can have salmonella and E. coli in it, and I just try and avoid having that as a possible issue. Site basics. The tomatoes use some nitrogen. They use a lot of phosphorus and a medium amount of potassium. They need 6 to 8 hours of sun. Raised beds are great if your soil is wet. If you've got frangipans, I know in my yard I've got frangipans, and I do have trouble with things. I try and put everything on a raised bed. Just having that wet soil causes a lot of plant problems. So if you've got wet soil, if you don't have well-drained soil, make a raised bed or do something to improve the drainage. You need to have water where it's easily available. It gets to be a real chore if you don't. So you need to have a good water source close by. And you might consider fencing and pest control for your site, because sooner or later there's something that gets in there and causes you problems, whether it's a rabbit or a squirrel or a deer. So take pest control into account, the large pests. If you want to check your soil type and drainage, you can go to the Web Soil Survey online and type in your address, and you don't hit return on your address until you're ready to search. If you're typing in your address and you hit return to put in your city or state, it's going to do a search before you've got it all in there. But that's great. It'll pull up all kinds of information about your site and the soil. And there's also a smartphone app that's out of California, UC Davis, called Soil Web. And you can, wherever you're standing, you can find out where the soil type is. You just bring that up and click on location, and it'll bring up your soil type and give you information about it. So some planting basics, and is you want good airflow, 2 to 4 feet apart. You can dip root balls of the plants in a starter solution before planting to help them grow faster and flower sooner. I never do this, but you can. It's nice to plant. I think it's nice to plant on a cloudy day because plants are going to be a little bit shocked when they go in the ground. And if you can plant when there's a couple of cloudy days, then they're not as stressed. In our area, we say plant after Derby Day to minimize frost risk. In northern Kentucky, you're probably looking at May 15th or so. And then you want to mulch to stabilize the moisture and reduce weeds. You can mulch with straw, cardboard, covered with mulch, newspaper, landscape fabric, white plastic with drip tape underneath it. If you're going to use plastic, you're going to need drip tape because the moisture is not going to get in there. Some people will water in the hole, but usually if you're going to use plastic, they use drip tape under it. This year in our demo garden, we put down cardboard covered with mulch on everything. My master gardeners don't want to weed this summer. So yeah, they worked really hard on the mulching. It looks good. Optimum soil conditions, soil, air, and water. I'm kind of jumping back and forth a little bit, but just to illustrate the issue with good air. This is some tomatoes growing in a kettle, and you can see they're pretty pitiful. Now they've been in this kettle several weeks, and they've looked like this several weeks. It was my neighbor. He had 6 in there. I took 4 of them and put them in my high tunnel. So the plants you see on the left, these 2 pictures were taken the same day. And the plants on the left are from the same 6-pack as the 2 in the kettle. And the picture's taken on the same day. So that is soil conditions. Mine are planted in coir with good airflow and irrigation dripping through. They've got good oxygen, good water supply, what they need in the soil. And the ones in the kettle don't. So that's just to show you how soil conditions can affect a tomato plant. Planting deep. You can plant deep, you don't have to, but it can moderate the root temperatures. I think it may be really important in warmer areas like Florida and Arizona as you go down south. You can reduce lodging on your leggy plants. You can actually dig it deep, or you can trench them sideways. I think you may get better rooting when you trench them sideways, because tomatoes are one of the few plants that can root off the stem. You can't do this to most garden plants, but a tomato responds pretty well. And you can get an increased yield and early on. You can have flowering earlier and higher yields early on. This yield advantage does tend to decrease with successive harvests, but you cannot do this with a grafted tomato. You can plant in all kinds of pots. You can plant them out of the bottom of a 5-gallon pot if you want to, just to have something for your neighbors to talk about. You can do ideally a 10-gallon pot for a determinate type and a 20-gallon for an indeterminate type. Mainly, if you can go to a larger size, you don't have to water it near as often. The smaller your container, the more you're going to have to check it and water it. Blossom end rot is a major thing with tomatoes. It's a physiological disorder. It's not a disease. And the first fruit are generally the most affected. It does not always mean that there's a lack of calcium in the soil. I'd say most of the time it's not a lack of calcium in the soil. Sometimes it can be because the plant's not able to take up and transport enough water. It can be because there's not enough roots in a very wet or a dry soil. It can be that the water is really humid and the water uptake has slowed. If you cultivate too close to the roots and cut some roots off, that can cause a problem. If your pH is low, below 6.0, that can cause you some problems. And also if your nitrogen fertility is too high, if you have excessive growth and the calcium is going to this new growth due to high transpiration, you can have most of the calcium going to the new growth and not enough to the tomatoes. Also, if you have high concentrations of other cations in the soil, that can cause you a problem. It can help somewhat to use nitrate fertilizers like calcium nitrate and potassium nitrate. And then you're avoiding the ammonia cation. You've got the calcium and ones that they're going to take up that you want them to take up. It is disheartening in the summer when you've got a nice crop of tomatoes and they all get blossom end rot in the early spring and you're looking for that first tomato. So there are some other contributing factors that, it's actually a complex thing, blossom end rot. And so they've been doing a lot of research on it, trying to figure it out. And it does seem to be related. It's related to stress. And it's also moving the calcium in the plant. And there's some hormones in the plant, gibberellins and ABA, abscisic acid, I'll call it ABA, that affect that. And if a plant is stressed and produces more gibberellins, then it tends to move the calcium into the vacuoles of the cells instead of into the walls of the cell. And so that's from some California research. So that causes the cells to, even though there's plenty of calcium in the plant, the cells are not getting it. If there's more ABA in the plant, that hormone, then the plants close the stomates in the leaves, and it increases the water flow to the fruit and the calcium to the fruit, and it can decrease or even stop blossom end rot in the spring. So stress and hormones are big contributors to blossom end rot. It's pretty complicated. If it gets cold, so we may see eventually whether there's an ABA spray that we can put on our plants to stop blossom end rot in the spring. In the spring we have the fast luxuriant growth, we'll get cool weather, different things will happen, and we tend to get a lot of blossom end rot. So the calcium is mostly coming in through the water. It's hard to get calcium to spray it on the leaves and get it into the fruit. Some people think that if you do it early, that it might get in there, but I think our vegetable specialists and others say it just doesn't happen. You can't spray calcium on the leaves or the fruit and get it into the tomato. I think I had that typed in there, but I'm not seeing it right now. So it's, for the most part, spraying with something like Stop Rot does not help stop blossom end rot. So really, it's probably not worth your while to use calcium sprays, even though I have it right there. You want to soil test and follow your soil lime recommendation. Don't force your plants to grow too quickly. And there again, that's another reason not to pour the nitrogen on there. Use the low nitrogen fertilizers. Mulch around your plants to keep that moisture from evaporating, to give them even moisture. Drip irrigation on a timer can be great if you can get that set up. And then calcium sprays, if you use them, if there's any chance they'll work, it's early in the season while the fruit are small. Okay, I threw in this one. It's not in the slide set. Sorry, I was tweaking things even still this morning. But as far as organic tomatoes go, there's a lot of people trying to raise them organically. Help yourself out. If you're going to try and do organic tomatoes, you've got a smaller arsenal of things to fight diseases and problems. So you want to start well. You want to have good, well-drained soil, and you want to have disease-resistant varieties. Get grafted plants. Help yourself out. You need to plant where you have good airflow around the plants, which reduces the disease. And then you want to follow really good sanitation. You want to get the weeds out of there. If you've got any disease plants, bag them up and get them out of there. Disease leaves you want to pull off and get rid of. You're going to be using organic fertilizers like compost and manure, lime and rock phosphate. It still helps to soil test and then get an idea of where you're at and add these things as needed. A lot of organic people use cover crops that they turn under, which adds a lot of organic matter and nutrients in the soil, and then still helps to mulch on top of the soil. You can consider using garlic and onions and zinnias and marigolds as companion plants to repel aphids and whiteflies. And marigolds are also good for repelling or for reducing the number of root knot nematodes in the soil. You can use copper and sulfur as fungicides, but they are also phytotoxic, and copper can be, and copper can kill earthworms. So they will help you out, but they should be used judiciously. Pyrethrum is a chrysanthemum extract that degrades quickly, but it is effective on a lot of insects and aphids. So that's kind of maybe one of your last resort chemicals to use if you've got a problem and can't get it under control another way. And then you can use insecticidal soaps for aphids and whiteflies. Neem does well on a lot of things. It kind of repels insects, will kill aphids and whiteflies. And there's biological controls like ladybugs, parasitic wasps, and lacewings. You can use BT for caterpillars and some beetles, but it's more effective on the smaller, younger stages if you're going to use BT as a spray. And it actually does have a thing where you're supposed to wear a respirator. Some people have allergies for it, and that's why they want you to wear a respirator, because of the allergies. I can see I left one off of here. I left off spinosad. Spinosad I use quite a bit. I use it in my rotation, and it's a fermentation product from bacteria, and it works very well on a lot of insects. It's locally, they sell it as Captain Jack's Brew, which I like that name. So I've helped the local hardware store sell a lot of spinosad, I think. You can also use traps, and you can vacuum insects off. And I think we may try some vacuuming this summer for our squash plants, for those squash bugs. They terrorize us every summer. I'm not going to go into a bunch of diseases. Faye Koosman did a great job on this last year, and the video is posted on the Hort Wednesday webinar site. So, you know, you want to prune disease leaves. We've talked about that. Follow a spray schedule. If you're not organic, even if you are organic, a regular spray schedule, because most of the sprays you use are preventative when it comes to diseases. If I run into timber rot or southern blight, which have sclerotia that can persist in the soil, that's a disease of the stem. Those plants I pull out and I put in a plastic bag, and they go to the dump. So you don't want to keep them anywhere on your property, because those sclerotia can persist for a long period of time. Most of the time, if I get timber rot, it's one plant, maybe two, and I get them out of there. A lot of the wilts you can control by rotating your area and good drainage. And if that doesn't work, you can buy varieties with resistance. So good sanitation, disease-resistant varieties. Also, don't work your plants when they're wet, because you can spread diseases. And then disinfect your tools, trays, and pots, and that will help you not spread problems. So there's a lot of sprays, fungicides, and insecticides you can use. Spider mites, to me, the easiest way to deal with them is a strong spray of water. But you start with I like to follow IPM, which you start with the safest low toxicity products. And then if you have to, use the stronger ones. Generally, I find in the spring, I don't need as much. And as the summer gets hotter and more humid, then I start to need the stronger chemicals. We do have this handout. It's Sustainable Disease Management of Solanaceous Crops in the Home Garden. And that's available online, or you can get one at your extension office. And it shows a rotation of chemicals through the season for different things that can affect your plants. There's a picture of a timber rot in the stem, and that dark spot on it is a sclerotia. Whoops. In there forming probably, and that can persist in the soil for a long time and continue to cause disease. There's a picture. I'm just showing you a couple of them this one's my nemesis. I have some root knot nematode in my high tunnel, but I just have it in one row, and it can't travel through dry soil. So if I am very careful and don't pull that soil into my other rows because it's dry in between, I may be able to keep it isolated in my high tunnel. But you can use nematode resistant plants. Watch your sanitation, and you can solarize. If you can heat treat it up to 160, 180 degrees, you can get it out of there. But I'm not sure how to go about doing that. Supposedly chitin mixed in the soil will help, and any organic matter and compost you add can help control root knot nematodes. So there's the slide for Faye's presentation that is posted online if you want to see more on tomato diseases. Just some mistakes I have seen that, maybe are not obvious, but I've seen people last year plant in a container, and they use topsoil, and then they put all kinds of manure and compost on top. There was no drainage holes in the bottom, and it looked dry. The compost on top looked dry, and they kept watering it, and the topsoil underneath was like soup. So the tomato plants died. So drainage holes, really use potting soil in a pot. Don't use topsoil. Check your moisture. It doesn't hurt to stick your finger in there and just see. I've seen planting in a furrow, and I think the idea was that they would have more moisture, but what happened was it rained a lot and the tomato plants got diseased. I don't remember now what the disease was, but they lost most of their tomatoes that were planted in the furrow where the water sat. So high and dry is what you want for a tomato, and then just water as needed. Sometimes you can sucker too aggressively and remove your growing points, so watch that. If you do want to have a really flavorful tomato at the end of the season or even during the season, I've seen where people do custom where they grow plants and then they deliberately top them, and that forces all the sugars into the tomatoes. You can have a really good tasting tomato. So sometimes people deliberately stop a plant from growing and force all those sugars into the tomato just to get a super tomato. And you can do that at the end of the growing season too. But while you're growing, watch your suckering to make sure you don't remove your important growing points. Not doing something for weed control early, you can end up with a real nightmare. Get on your weed control now and watch your nitrogen. And there is a checklist of all the things, or maybe not all of them, but a lot of the things you can do to make sure you have good tomatoes. I won't go through them all. And I think I may not have had this. We might have to repost this PowerPoint online to get that put in there. But if you do all these things, tomatoes really aren't that bad and to raise. They're not that hard. Just got to get some habits built into your system, and you can have wonderful tomatoes that can persist through, in our area, into October. I think we just get tired of them eventually and pull them out. Sometimes you can even get them into November. So you really need to walk around. Walking around does wonders every day. Take your cup of coffee or your tea, and you can look for those caterpillar droppings and get on them early if you've got an infestation of caterpillars or something else. If you're picking them, you can pick them before they're ripe. If you have tomatoes like heirlooms that tend to crack, pick them before they're totally ripe and then let them finish inside, and you can avoid that cracking. Or if it's really hot, you can pick them and bring them inside to ripen so they get the red color instead of that orange color, and you can store them for a couple weeks. Everybody knows don't put them in the refrigerator. You lose flavor and they get mushy. And in the fall, at the end of the year, you can bring them in and you can wrap them in newspaper or just lay newspaper on top and put them in your coolest location, 50 to 60 degrees. Last year, I put some in from my high tunnel in November, and we were finishing them up in February, finished eating them in February. So you can bring in those green. Most of the time it says that they have to be pale green. I think I brought some in that were pretty dark green and they still ripen. And that's it. Thank you all.